Hi, good evening, and Leslie, thank you for the opportunity. Excited to be here to talk to you all. Forgive me for any typos in the presentations, mishaps throughout the presentation. I am 3 hours ahead of you all, currently in Florida. But yeah, super excited to unpack this presentation. Just as a heads up, it's informal, so if you do want to interject at any point, you can raise your hand and I'll do my best to get to it as soon as possible, even though it may have to get tabled for the Q&A section of this presentation because I can only see so many windows on my monitor. But yeah, let's get started. Cool. Yeah, so that's me. This presentation isn't linear at all. It's organic. These slides, I wouldn't contextualize them as a presentation. It's more of a discussion guide. So it's a free-flowing dialogue. And I'll start with a little bit of background. I'm from Homestead, Florida. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Florida, but it's way at the bottom right before the Keys. That previous slide is the damage after Hurricane Andrew in 1993. That's kind of what unfortunately put Homestead, Florida on the map, that and Walmart. So I say all that to say I wasn't steeped in design culture. It was something that kind of found me looking at magazines that piqued my interest. You know, coming up back in the days, there wasn't even an IKEA. So I was not surrounded by a lot of amazing design inspiration, but I did end up at Design and Architecture senior high school, of which I graduated in 2003. And that was my first exposure to like brass tacks industrial design. And I loved it from the minute I saw it. Oddly enough, I ended up really being drawn to this transportation design sketch. And I found my way to Art Center. After I graduated Art Center, I went back and looked at that magazine clipping and found out that it was an Art Center student who had sketched it. So it's just funny how things come full circle when you don't even expect it. But really, I honed my skills at Art Center. I went pretty young. The average student age is lower now, but I went at the time, which was pretty polarizing for me at age 17. And the average student there was 24. So there's all sorts of culture shock in that regard, but it all worked out. I graduated, before we get into where I graduated, let's touch on some of my internships. I interned at Panasonic in Japan. That's one of the most remarkable experiences of my life to date. I also interned at K-Swiss and did a kind of like a hybridized internship within Art Center that was sponsored by Nike called the Lead Program for Footwear. And it was a sustainable shoe development project that was awesome. That was back in 2007. From there, I graduated in 2008, which is probably a lot like what it's like to graduate right now. Right now we're having all of these layoffs and the job market scarce. At that time, we had the economic crash. So I get that sentiment. It'll be okay. From there, yeah, it was about a year of doing odd jobs and freelance. And then I landed a job at Samsung in Los Angeles and then grew with that company into that office, moved to San Francisco and was in the Samsung Design America office in San Francisco, which was more of an incubator. From there, I went to Logitech and spent most of my time at Logitech working on Ultimate Ears, which is their audio line. And then I took a break from tech, moved to LA, kind of started dabbling with my own brand, was also freelancing and worked at a startup called Romeo Power, ended up getting to manager level there and worked on consumer electronics for portable battery packs. And there was also B2B business for like these lithium batteries for business clients. So this is kind of a spread of some of the things I've worked on, and I'll get into each one detail by detail as we go on. At this point, it's safe to say I'm a design thinker with a really good acumen for developing experiences that can help businesses grow. I'm a human-centered designer, not in a typical sense, and I'll get into that later. But I really like to blend lifestyle and the traditional industrial design methods in new ways and just where they intersect and how I can do that differently. Have had a lot of experience in consumer electronics, soft goods, fashion and lifestyle, and have dove pretty deep into wearables. With some other helpful sensibilities sprinkled in there, like strategy, art direction, and visual storytelling. I actually love emotive film and photography, and I interject these elements into my process as much as possible at multiple project phases. So just as an example, when I was with Samsung, we were trying to figure out how we're going to launch these headphones. So I went and did a whole mock campaign on my own, spent my own money to do it, sourced my own talent. And the whole goal there was to influence and inspire the internal marketing team for the assets that we could use to tell the story of the industrial design development. So it's a really proactive effort there. Some of the assets from that effort you can see here. So again, that was the wardrobe, finding the photographer to communicate this theme. We had prescribed that we wanted to have this segment called Professionals, and it was our angle against Beats, which were really bass heavy, totally different market. So how does our market look and feel? So it didn't come across like Beats or any others at the time. And this was back in 2012. So again, I'm just going to organically move through my process. How do I approach form development? I like to think about the context before the archetype. So I try to throw archetypes out and really just let any pre-existing thing in my brain go. So for example, if you were asked to design a chair, the first thing I do is try to get rid of this idea of chair in my head because it blocks you into a certain corner. So I would rather say, how would I comfortably support human weight? And then it opens up everything without that model in my brain. So I'm going to think it could be a cushion. It could be something suspended from the ceiling. Of course, it's going to go really left in the beginning with that approach. But as it gets closer to the right, you find that you have all these elements you could pull from to get something that's a little more differentiated. And that's pretty much what I apply to everything. And no, I didn't design that chair you see. That's a famous Vitra chair, but I think you all get the idea. I also am really fond of objects blending into their use context. So with my brand, Normal Objects, and this is just one example of an organization for your desk essentials, but I really wanted an object here that felt object first. It didn't feel like full of function. It's just a beautiful artifact that is an accent of home decor, and the function isn't too obvious, but it also is pretty functional in optimizing space savings, and it allows you to elevate these writing so everything's clean and doesn't take up a bunch of space with the footprint because it's the functionality is occupying its own footprint. So that's just an example. But if this was closed and you didn't see anything, it would just look like some sculptural element. Also did that in a lot of concepts when I was Samsung. This was a Bluetooth speaker with an inductive charging function. So if you're looking at it, it just looks like this object. And as this device gets closer to it, the magnet makes this function actuate. It slides back, it turns on the speaker and starts charging the phone. So it's not alive until you tell it to be. And in context, it kind of just disappears. I think it's always fun when I get to remix age-old archetypes. So this was an independent project I did with a buddy of mine who's an art director and a filmmaker. We just wanted to redesign a Morse tapping key. And what could that mean? This is something that's age-old and has not been redesigned ever. So what would it mean to take a common utility and then translate it into a completely new form? And we came up with this. And in that same series that was called Analog Artifacts, I worked on a lighter that takes an existing archetype and introduces a new utility. So you slide it out, there's matches inside, and you strike it on the bottom. This is a tongue-in-cheek exercise, but it's about thinking about objects, context, and form in new ways. And so when it all comes together, my love for emotive film, my approach to form development kind of looks and feels like this. It's pulling a bunch of resources to collaborate to have an output. So we figured out all these gimbals, we developed this visual narrative, and then we put the story together. ultimately, the what I really seek to do is to make you feel. And that's what I mean by human-centered. It's not in the common sense where, yeah, of course, you need to understand pain points, ethnographics, and all that level of research as table stakes for design and any level of good design. But what I want to do to really push the envelope is make people feel something. This feeling and felt design, this emotive element that exists alongside the common approaches to design. So it's really also exciting when I'm asked to do entire object families. So when I was the lead designer at Samsung, I was able to pioneer their audio line, let me do the over-ear, on-ear, and also the in-ear monitors, as well as all the soft goods and peripherals. So it's an opportunity to let a design language translate across a suite of products, but then also see how that same language translates from hard to soft goods. Learned a lot about soft goods here. It became something I was keen on throughout my career and even today. Some of the funnest projects are when I'm able to play around with cut and sew and different kind of architectures that come from the soft goods world. So some career wins, I was undecided about this term. I don't like the word win or success. It's just things I felt good about, I guess. We're back in 2014. This was the Gear Fit. It sold 250,000 units in the first month and did pretty well thereafter. But what it really did was pioneer wearables for Samsung, which was number one the 4 years, right when the Apple Watch was launching. So they were the first, and then Apple, of course, came and ate their lunch. But for a while, they held the title of being the most progressive in the wearable space. And I like to think that I contributed to that effort. We are also the leading edge of implementing flexible OLED in common space in consumer electronics. Wasn't happening a ton at the time in mass. Another thing I like to do for process outside of thinking context is looking to draw inspiration from analogous areas, objects, and spaces to the left and right of the area you're tasked to design within. So for the speakers, we did a lot of looking at footwear. What kind of construction could we pull? What kind of CMF could we pull? And it made sense for the context of use still because it needed to be this durable, life-proof thing. And sneakers and outerwear do that naturally. So it makes sense to kind of be inspired. It also prevents us just from doing another speaker. This has been replicated by a lot of brands at this point. So fabrics applied to speakers isn't new. And I wasn't the first person to do it. Non-Object and Agency did the first generation of Boom, but I was tasked with doing the Wonder Boom. So smaller budget, less resources, and you still had to have a hit. And it worked out. So I consider this another win. This one sold over 7 million. It's the UE Wonder Boom, and the initial ID direction hasn't changed too much from generation to generation. So if you set up an archetype, it lasted the gamut through multiple generations. I also like to experiment with what I don't know, to discover what I don't know that I don't know. For Wonder Boom, this meant sewing. At this point in my life, I had not done a lot. So this started with getting socks actually from Walmart, I think. I just cut them up and started stretching them over forms to understand how 3D knitting works. And again, this was back in like 2015. So Flyknit was just getting started. Those 3D knitting machines were just getting out there. And we didn't fully understand how to apply this to consumer electronics and speakers. The first generations of booms didn't go all the way around the object. So that challenge meant getting my hands dirty, grabbing a sewing machine and any available materials, even just ordering swatches and seeing how we could do processes that were akin to apparel and footwear manufacturing. A lot of iterations, a lot of just being at home and doing a lot of independent development and being at the studio at work to understand gaps in feasibility of applying textiles to this kind of form factor. I also worked on its bigger siblings, the Boom 3 and the Mega Boom 3. Again, this one was a little different. Its predecessor was the best selling Bluetooth speaker already. So the challenge was on our team to see what we could do. And how do you reinvent a classic that was already a hit? Trying to repeat a hit is very hard in any industry. Just ask any music artist. So what levers could we pull here that we didn't previously? And it helped me learn a lot about how CMF can drive ID, and CMF is not this applied afterthought. It really came down to making the textile the hero here and getting this iridescent effect and getting it to wrap all around the object in a beautiful way and stand out in a striking way amongst a bunch of, like, a sea of plastic. And it took working very collaboratively with the CMF team down to the material science level to make this work. So that was a very fun project, a ton of iteration, and it was fun all the way through. So I'm big on collaboration and the idea of team, and it's often oversaid, not always applied. But some of the most amazing things have been established through working with mechanical engineers and electrical engineers and just anyone who specializes in something that's not design or industrial design, to just allow you to have a different point of view. And I think sometimes, I wouldn't say so much in college and institutions, but definitely in the professional world, things are too siloed and people kind of stick to their specialties a little too much. And I think it can be limiting, and I'll get into that a little later. But I'm always very proactive. If I'm just playing with something, I'll go down to the engineering lab and just start asking a bunch of questions and seeing how they can prototype, because they're looking at things in ways we aren't. And I've dynamically changed industrial design directions with inputs from not only the marketing teams and engineers, but just any fresh set of eyes. I would encourage that. So this is just some images from my time in China when I was working on the Wonder Boom. This is the anechoic chamber. If you all don't know what that is, it's a very weird sensation. You go in there and you don't hear anything and you're bouncing around because they're trying to measure how sound waves bounce off of forms and what kind of 360 directional sound they're getting. A bunch of just on the spot, very ad hoc prototyping with the engineering team in the factory in South China. It's a really great experience to see stuff at that scale. If you all haven't been, it's kind of eye-opening. And getting into the nitty-gritty is a real thing you're going to do professionally. And it takes up months of your life. So when I was at Samsung, I went to Korea, I think 14 times in 1 year. I kind of lost all my friends in the US. I had more friends in Korea at the time than I had in the US. And that's just a slice, this little image on the bottom right that has A labeled on it. That's a stack of 6 months of follow-up work on these headphones of just every iterative change I did across 6 months. So you really are invested into the development of these things and making sure that in design integrity from the beginning is carried out through the end and ultimate fruition of the design. Just process snapshots from various projects here. Shots of working with the team and prototyping with cardboard. That's the business unit, talking strategy and form factors on the other side, exploded views. In 2017, when I took my break from Silicon Valley Tech, I went to LA, simultaneously started Normal Objects. But that was kind of in the back burner. I was just getting the feel for what I wanted to do there. But in my day job, I was contracted with a startup developing this battery pack. And this was especially fun and daunting because we did end-to-end development on this in the US. So it was a team of 30 of us in the beginning that we put this thing together from an ID concept to this entire component layout and PCB board was done in the United States. Created a factory in Vernon, Los Angeles, and made this thing real. And then they replicated that and built an assembly line in Guadalajara, Mexico. So that was the most responsibility I had in terms of taking ID and stepping out of that role and to getting into design for manufacturing and making a concept very real and very fast. That was all done in 9 months. For CE, that is kind of lightning fast. More recently, most recently, I was at Peloton in New York City. There was a big debacle there and the layoff happened that I was part of. So I don't actually have Peloton work I can show, but right before that, I was at Google for about 2.5 years working on the Pixel Watch program mainly, but I was also a contributor for the Pixel Buds A. The biggest thing I did on this program outside of setting up the early architectures as a Gen 2 to the first one was this visual storytelling and the art direction and photography and visual elements coming together with ID to give the look and feel of a desired communication. And then we have the Pixel Watch, which launched a few months back, which is a huge team that worked tirelessly to do this. And I was the lead. So I was a contributor on the main device, but I was the lead on the bands. And why this video is being shown here is because that intersection and how they actually come together and work took forever. But also applied, everything kind of came full circle here, where a lot of soft goods I had been experimenting with, a lot of understanding design for manufacturing, a lot of CMF and working with those teams, telling stories to business units. It all came together at my experience with Google. And I mean, it is a pretty utopian place to work. You have all these resources for prototyping and making things fast, and these budgets that allow you to do so and iterate. So I'm really honored that I was able to have that experience. But again, this is just some of the lifestyle elements and how we tell stories through images and materiality for that project. And currently is normal objects. So when you get a moment, feel free to check out the website. But it's really a marketplace for shoppers to discover and support a diverse global community of creatives. And it's really about shopping bespoke objects for mindful living. So the biggest thing is discovering and supporting, and enablement and responsible small batch production. We don't want to make a bunch of stuff the world doesn't need. It's highly considered. It's line to line mapped with demand. And it's really about, if you're an artist or a creative and you don't have a large audience, it's a platform to make sure you get discovered and people could support you as support your brand on our marketplace. So collaboration and community, and collaboration and teamwork is something I'm going to keep reiterating throughout this. Some of the stuff we've worked on is small space organization, just things that you will use in your everyday life that makes every little moment a little more elevated. Rehashing archetypes. This is an espresso mug. So it's all of the things coming together that I mentioned previously are articulated through this brand. And we do community activations like exhibitions. Again, that's the discovery aspect for the community platform. And I would say at this point, we're going to transition into the themed area of this talk, which are my career takeaways and building bridges over barriers. So first, I'll talk about designers connecting to other designers. I'll get into companies connecting to designers, and then you connecting with yourself based on some experiences I've had. So when it comes to designers connecting to other designers, there's a tension there. It's felt but not always seen, but it's definitely a thing. So back to this subject of teams, to be honest with you, I don't think I've ever experienced 100% teamwork. Just haven't. I'm going to be super honest. So I don't think I've ever gotten to witness what's actually possible if it were to occur. And I think that's a miss. I think we can do better. The reason I'm saying that is because we often say teamwork, but we tend to praise and celebrate single superstar designers, right? It's this thing we do. So I'll ask for a second, can anyone tell me your favorite designer right now? I'm sure someone can. It's hard for me to say anything, so I'll imagine someone said something. If not, I'll tell you mine. My favorite designer is Nato Fukasawa, not just because I spent time in Japan, but I love his work. And I said his work. But can anyone name the person responsible for like the mechanical engineering that brought any of his designs to life? Any of the CMF artists that were responsible for, you know, bringing the full story together when it came to texture, color, form, and materiality? The packaging designer that made that out of the box experience amazing. The supply chain solutions people who, this wouldn't be a product if you didn't have them, et cetera, and so on. I think you get the idea. So we talk about teamwork, but we still are so individually focused in design. I think there's this weird dichotomy that's happening. I would ask you to raise your hands if we're in a physical space, but I'll raise mine because I'm guilty of this in earlier days and probably even still today. But how many of you have held back tips, tricks, and methods because of competition, performance metrics, credit, or fear of giving someone else an advantage. And especially within the context of if you're on the same team. I've done this, but it's the structure that reinforces this behavior. And I think it's kind of toxic and it's limiting, because if I give someone a little bit of something, they give someone else a little bit of something, and we're all giving, there's just more to use and utilize towards solving problems, coming up with more inventive thinking. I think this is something that is 100% I experienced in the real world, right? Where your performance at the end of, you get these performance cycles like every 90 days, right? It's like, well, what have you done? What are you responsible for? Why aren't they inquiring to what the team has done? And when accolades and accreditations given, why isn't it the whole team? Though I heard one story that, there was someone up, there was a manager up for promotion at Google, and he said something like, I'm not going to get promoted unless you promote the whole team, because it wasn't me who did this. And I just think more of that thinking is what we need, and less of this individualistic stuff. And the design world has historically been this way, very individual focused. But then at the same time, you're called out if you're kind of egotistical, or if you're cocky, you have an ego. It's like, well, yeah, the system made it this way to survive. Like, I didn't help anyone because I need my portfolio to be awesome. I think about myself because I need a promotion, right? I'm trying to make money, so I have to be concerned about my business. It's not super team playerish. So I'm just wondering if there's an opportunity to change that, especially when this behavior is currently encouraged and rewarded. So people hold back, steal, etc., just to get ahead, and that's really not connection. I'm wondering where that ever came from. You can spend time thinking, ruminating on that if you want, but I would rather spend time thinking about what's possible if we started to like do that less and actually share more and come together more and really try to function as a team, knowing that ultimately when you help somebody, it's not going to hurt you. And where could we take design together? This is a quote from a Greek proverb that I thought said it pretty well. So a society grows great when old men plant trees whose shade they will never sit in. It's really about good people doing things for other people. That's it, the end. No expectations of what you get in return. It's just trying to help for the betterment of the design world, each other, just on a human level. So I would challenge at every juncture in your career or day to day, are you creating a bridge or creating a barrier? Are your actions making it more favorable for the team, or is it inhibiting your team? When you're somewhere and the institution says everything needs to be so separated and siloed, are you reaching out to make bridges and connections to encourage possibilities and challenging those conventions? 2, companies connecting to designers. Resources. I've always disliked that word. It doesn't feel human. It's not very considered. It's super mechanical. It's like oil. It's a resource. There's not that much humanity in it. And it also kind of assumes that there's this group of things as a whole unit that's all the same. Again, I think that's a miss. And when you start to look at stuff as units and titles and assumptions, that all gets in the way. Again, creating barriers to possibilities and a free flow of ideas. So start by building relationships and then maybe execute things in specialized verticals. And what I mean by that is at the beginning of a project, for instance, sometimes it'll be like, okay, ID is going to take this and we're going to ideate, and then we're going to bounce it off marketing. And then that's going to go up to the VP. And then that's going to go to this person. And then it'll go to CMF. It's like, well, I'm kind of an advocate for getting everyone in the room from the jump. But when it comes to having to go specialized in certain areas, when it has to be, all right, ID needs to handle this because we're experts and specialists, fine. But that expert and special delineation from the beginning totally blocks the input of what would otherwise be completely amazing, unique ideas that aren't blocked by your own bias from your ID experience. So I think it's a huge miss as well. One thing when it comes to talent or looking at talent, institutions, employers, There's this notion of a T-shaped designer. I don't know if you all are familiar with that, but I would say not only look at a T-shape, but consider an I shape. So if you're not familiar with a T-shape, it means you have this vertical that you're really good in. So it's like, for me, I guess that would be ID. It's what you spent the most time being super learned in, and you have the most skills in. But then they're also going to look at what other skills you balance in a wide sense. So maybe it's graphic design and art direction, and then that's your T. So you're really strong in this thing. If you're on a project, we know we can pull you in for ID, but if we're in a bind, we may be able to lean on you for graphics and art direction as well. That's common, and this is encouraged. And I've even been asked in interviews, okay, what's your T shape? Cool. Again, I encourage companies and institutions to consider an individual's I shape. So T-shaped designers can be capable in a lot of things, and I'm pretty good at one of them. When you're looking at an I shape, you have what you're really good at, you have what you're pretty good at, but I think what we don't really look at is background, and what you're bringing from a cultural reference point, and then just influence reference point, which means your point of view in that regard is different, and that point of view can help an outcome through a vertical as it goes wide. But it's not forcing these things to disappear, your background and your culture, right? And say you just have to be really talented at ID in this vertical and nothing else really matters, because it does, it impacts. And I'll get more into how that is my personal story later, and what my I culture and influence and how it's impacted line to line with how I design. But I'm not going to go too deep on it. It's just trying to prevent companies from uncomfortably forcing people and groups away from what could be really new thinking by putting them in this vertical that just never really fits. And I would say just harness the power of varied individuals from day one. I mentioned that earlier, sharing upfront from the beginning, not guarding, and promoting a free flow of communication, collaboration. Again, are you building a bridge or are you creating a barrier? Connecting to yourself. Embrace your point of view, but don't let it blind you, and don't let it scare you, and definitely don't ever lose it. Being creative or innovative, the overused word, and having viscous skills is not where it stops. Designers do not have to be skilled in all the same ways. Again, resources do. So really own your point of view. In my experience, I was way too focused on trying to acquire all the skills and be good at everything. I didn't stop and observe what actually came natural for me. For me, it was this inclination around visual storytelling, photography, and like these film type of aspects. And I waited too long to stop, so that led me to being super burnt out. And then you can leverage your limitations. So change the narrative of your limitations to focusing on your strengths and turning your strengths into superpowers. So a lot of people who are really good at anything say they know when to stop something, and they don't try to be good at everything, but they realize what they can be good at and they lean into it, and it becomes a superpower. So as much time as you would spend trying to get good in 17 different things, spend that much time reflecting on, hey, what am I naturally pretty good at, and lean into it. So it comes to quitting tactically. That doesn't mean just quit or be a quitter. You do the work. It doesn't mean you don't try. Like, you do the work, you give it your best, but just take note when it's not working. Take note when it's causing you significant duress, significant burnout, when you're way behind, because there may be a misalignment that's going to cost you financially and from a time standpoint and from a burnout standpoint, because burnout is so real. You can spend a lifetime trying to get better and better, and you'll be completely burnt out. And this is true for top performers and athletes, corporate CEOs, whatever have you. They quit what's not working. They spend a lot of time learning to lean into and sell what is. So for me, when it came to like my eye shape, having come from Homestead, Florida, with no exposure to anything, from day one, I had to be really crafty about doing a lot with not that much. So that became my MO. And I took that with every project I worked on. So when some people would complain, oh, we don't have enough money for a prototype, or this isn't going to work. That was never my point of view. My point of view was always looking at, okay, well, what do we have and how can we do more with it? So prime example was this speaker project that I led. This project had 1/2 the budget of its predecessor. It had 1/2 the time. It had 1/2 the resources, but it had to hit the same targets in terms of profit margin and actually do better. So in the beginning, it was very easy to go and tell the people who tasked you to design this thing, like, hey, we need more money. We need more time. This just isn't going to work. But that wasn't my approach. I was like, okay, this is what we have, so I'll make it work. And you spend a lot of time thinking about that. So, okay, less plastic, that's going to save a ton of money. Fabric on average is cheaper because we don't have to make these big injection molding tools. So there's a bunch of tools that came out of thinking of just embracing what you have instead of complaining about it. Again, playing to your strengths. And then putting something out there and having it be a success. So this smaller device had less BOM. We had to work really closely. Again, collaboration and teamwork. Engineers were in there from day one. It was an all hands on deck thing. Marketing was there. What's the right story? How can we do it in a lean way? Is it feasible? How much time do we have? Let's validate it. But it was everyone working together from day one. So I think when that happens, things are naturally successful. And it just meant we took out a bunch of features that it didn't have to have. So less is more. It didn't need all the bells and whistles. It needed to do sound really well. It needed to last. It needed to be at this price point, and it had to look this way. Embrace that, and it was a win. So in the end, I just want to reinforce and reiterate, are you building a bridge or are you creating a barrier? And that is the presentation. Thank you all so much for the opportunity. I really appreciate it. Have a good one.